The concrete dust settled like ash around Sarah Chen's feet as the demolition crew finished destroying her dream. 27 years of savings, gone. Her neighbors cheered from their pristine lawns, thinking they'd won. But as Sarah pulled out, her phone to dial Channel 7 News, her hands weren't shaking from defeat, they were trembling with the electric thrill of someone about to expose the truth. Because what the Homeowners Association didn't know was that Sarah had documented everything. Every racist comment, every illegal demand, every forged signature. And now, with her pool reduced to rubble and their victory celebration echoing across Willowbrook Estates, she was about to turn there. Sarah Chen stood in her backyard at dawn, coffee steaming in her hands, watching the morning light dance across the pristine blue water of her new pool. 6 months of construction, 27 years of saving, and countless dreams had led to this moment. The infinity edge seemed to blend seamlessly with the horizon, just as she'd envisioned when she'd first sketched the design on a napkin. During her lunch breaks at the accounting firm, she dipped her toe into the perfectly heated water, feeling the stress of decades melt away. This wasn't just a pool, it was proof that a first-generation immigrant could build something beautiful in America. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Sarah turned to find her neighbor, Margaret Pemberton, peering over the 6-foot privacy fence that separated their properties. Margaret's silver hair was perfectly coiffed, despite the early hour, and her smile had that particular sharpness that Sarah had learned to recognize in the 3 years since moving to Willowbrook Estates. "It really is," Sarah replied, raising her mug in a small toast. "Would you like to come see the pool up close? The contractor just finished the final touches." "Yesterday." Margaret's smile faltered for just a microsecond. "Oh, that's quite all right. I can see plenty from here." Her eyes swept over the pool area with the precision of a military inspection. "It's certainly ... large." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever Margaret spoke, and that particular tone-sweet words wrapped around something harder. The city inspector approved all the dimensions. "Everything's up to code." "Oh, I'm sure it is." Margaret's laugh was like wind chimes in a storm. "It's just that some of us remember when Willowbrook was more ... understated, more in keeping with the neighborhood character." Before Sarah could respond, Margaret had disappeared back into her house, leaving only the lingering scent of her aggressive perfume and the uncomfortable feeling that something had just shifted in the carefully maintained peace of Willowbrook Estates. Sarah tried to shake off the encounter as she prepared for work, but Margaret's words echoed in her mind. She'd researched every regulation, hired licensed contractors, even paid for additional landscaping to screen the pool from neighboring properties. What more could they want? The answer came in her mailbox that evening. The letter was printed on cream-colored cardstock with the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association letterhead embossed in gold. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she read, "Dear Ms. Chen, it has come to the attention of the HOA board that recent construction on your property at 247 Maple Ridge Drive may not be in compliance with our community guidelines. Please attend a hearing on Friday, October 13th at 7 p.m. in the Willowbrook Community Center to address concerns regarding your pool installation. Failure to appear may result in fines and legal action. Sincerely, the HOA board." Sarah read the letter 3 times, her confusion growing with each pass. She'd received approval from the architectural committee before breaking ground. She had the paperwork to prove it. Friday evening arrived gray and drizzling, matching Sarah's mood as she walked into the community center, carrying a folder thick with permits, approvals, and receipts. The main room had been arranged with a long table, facing rows of folding chairs, most of which were occupied by her neighbors. Margaret Pemberton sat in the front row, flanked by the Johnsons, the Crafts, and at least a dozen other residents Sarah recognized from neighborhood barbecues and holiday parties. They all turned to watch her enter, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Ms. Chen called Richard Pemberton, Margaret's husband, from behind the long table. As HOA president, he commanded the meeting with the authority of someone who'd never been questioned. "Thank you for joining us. Please, take a seat." Sarah chose a chair in the 3rd row, directly behind the Hendersons, who had always seemed friendly. Tonight, they wouldn't meet her eyes. "We're here tonight," Richard began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "to discuss the pool installation at 247 Maple Ridge Drive." Several community members have raised concerns about whether this addition aligns with our neighborhood standards. Sarah stood up, her folder clutched against her chest. I have all my approvals right here. The architectural committee signed off on the plans 8 months ago. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret leaned over to whisper something too. The woman beside her, who nodded gravely. Richard cleared his throat. Yes, well, that's part of what we need to discuss. It seems there may have been some irregularities in that approval process. What kind of irregularities? Sarah's voice carried more edge than she'd intended. Richard shuffled through papers on the table. The committee feels that the pool's size and design are not consistent with the understated elegance that defines Willowbrook Estates. It's become something of a ... spectacle. A spectacle? Sarah's voice rose. It's a rectangular pool with a spa. There are 3 other pools on this street alone. Not like that one, called out Jim Kraft from the audience. That thing looks like it belongs at a resort, not in a residential neighborhood. The LED lighting is particularly concerning, added Margaret, standing to address the room. It's visible from space, practically. My husband and I haven't had a peaceful evening on our deck since you installed those lights. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. The lights are on a timer. They turn off at 10 p.m. every night. And the noise, continued another voice. The filter system runs constantly. All pools have filtration systems. Sarah protested, but her voice was drowned out by a chorus of complaints. The property values, setting a precedent, not what we signed up for when we moved here. Richard banged a small gavel against the table. Order, please, Ms. Chen. The board has reached a decision. He pulled out a formal document. Given the concerns raised by multiple community members, and upon review of the architectural guidelines, we're requiring that the pool be modified to meet community standards within 30 days. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Modified. How the size needs to be reduced by at least 40%. The infinity edge must be removed. It's too ostentatious. The lighting system needs to be replaced with something more subtle, and the spa needs to be relocated or removed entirely. The room spun slightly around Sarah. That would require demolishing almost the entire structure. The cost would be... She paused, doing rapid calculations. That would cost more than the original installation. Richard's expression didn't change. I'm sorry, Ms. Chen, but community standards must be maintained. If the modifications aren't completed within 30 days, we'll have no choice but to pursue legal action. Sarah looked around the room at faces she'd smiled at during neighborhood walks. People whose children she'd given Halloween candy to, couples she'd chatted with at the mailbox. Now they stared back at her with expressions ranging from smug satisfaction to uncomfortable guilt. I want to see the documentation, Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. The specific guidelines that my pool violates. Richard exchanged glances with Margaret. Of course, we'll have that sent to you by Monday. But as Sarah walked home through the drizzle, her folder of approvals clutched against her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that there were no specific guidelines. There was only the uncomfortable truth that her success, her joy, her beautiful pool had somehow become a problem that needed solving. She stood in her backyard that night, looking at the pool lights reflecting off the water like stars, and made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and began documenting every inch of her property, every permit, every approval letter. Because if they wanted a fight over community standards, Sarah Chen was going to give them exactly what they asked for. It opened with shaking fingers, her coffee growing cold as she spread the contents across her kitchen table. 3 pages. That was it. 3 pages of vague language about community, harmony, and architectural consistency with no specific measurements. No concrete guidelines, and certainly nothing that her pool violated. Sarah grabbed her phone and called the number at the bottom of the HOA letterhead. Willowbrook Estates Management. This is Janet. This is Sarah Chen at 247 Maple Ridge Drive. I received the documentation about my pool violation, but there are no specific guidelines listed. What exactly does my pool violate? A pause. Hold on. Let me transfer you to our compliance department. Classical music filled Sarah's ear for 10 minutes before Janet returned. I'm sorry, but our compliance officer is in meetings all day. Can I take a message? Sarah hung up and dialed again. Same runaround. By noon, she'd called 6 times and spoken to 4 different people, none of whom could explain what specific rule her pool violated. That's when she decided to get creative. Sarah had spent 15 years as a forensic accountant, tracking financial irregularities for law firms and insurance companies. If someone was hiding something in the numbers, she could find it. And if someone was manufacturing violations that didn't exist, she could prove that too. She started with the Willowbrook Estate's public records, requesting copies of all HOA board meeting minutes for the past 5 years. Then she pulled the architectural guidelines for every home improvement project approved in the last decade. By Thursday, her dining room table looked like a detective's evidence board, covered with documents, photographs, and a growing list of inconsistencies. The Hendersons' pool was larger than hers. The Crafts had installed LED lighting that was visible 3 streets away. The Williamsons had built a gazebo that wasn't even mentioned in the architectural guidelines. Yet somehow it had been approved without question. But it was the meeting minutes that told the real story. Sarah found the first mention of her pool buried in the notes from March 15th. Margaret P. raised concerns about the Chen project. Board agreed to monitor for compliance issues. Her pool hadn't even been built yet. The architectural committee had approved her plans on March 3rd. Margaret had started her campaign against the pool before the first shovel had touched the ground. Sarah kept digging. By Friday afternoon, she'd uncovered a pattern that made her stomach turn. Every homeowner who'd faced HOA violations in the past 3 years had one thing in common: they weren't white. The Rodriguezes had been cited for excessive landscaping, the same xeriscaping that the Millers had installed without comment. The Patels had been forced to repaint their house because the beige was not in harmony with neighborhood standards, while the Johnsons' bright yellow colonial stood untouched. The Washingtons had been fined for their children's basketball hoop, citing noise concerns despite the fact that half the street had identical hoops. Sarah printed everything: every email, every meeting minute, every selective enforcement action. The evidence filled to binders. Saturday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah answered her doorbell to find David Park, a man she recognized from the HOA meeting but had never spoken to directly. "Ms. Chen, I'm David Park from Elm Street. I was wondering if we could talk." Sarah invited him in, noting how his eyes swept over her evidence-covered dining room table. "I heard about your situation," David said, accepting a cup of coffee. "I wanted you to know you're not alone." "What do you mean?" David pulled out his phone and showed her a photo of a beautifully landscaped front yard. "This was my garden. Last year, I'm a landscape architect, been designing gardens for 20 years. The HOA made me rip it all out and replace it with grass. Why, they said it was too ethnic. Too many ornamental grasses and stone features, not consistent with colonial American landscaping traditions." David's laugh was bitter. Half these houses were built in 1987. What colonial American traditions? Sarah felt a familiar fire building in her chest. "Do you have documentation?" "Everything. And I know at least for other families who've been targeted." David leaned forward. "We've been talking about fighting back, but nobody wanted to be the first to stick their neck out. When we heard about your pool situation, ... double quotes, you realized they'd gone too far. A $27,000 pool. Sarah, they're asking you to demolish a $27,000 pool because it's too ostentatious. Meanwhile, the Pembertons just installed a wine cellar that cost more than most people's cars." Sarah walked to her dining room table and picked up one of the binders. "I think it's time we had a larger conversation." By Sunday evening, 8 families were gathered in Sarah's living room. The Rodriguezes, the Patels, the Washingtons, the Parks, the Lees, the Nugents, and the Johnsons, though Robert Johnson was white. His wife Keisha was black, and their mixed-race children had been the target of several noise complaints. Despite being honor roll students who spent most of their time indoors, they've been systematically targeting anyone who doesn't fit their idea of what Willowbrook should look like, said Maria Rodriguez, flipping through Sarah's evidence binders. "But they've been careful about it. Subtle. Not anymore, they haven't," said David, looking at the pool violation letter. "This is blatant." Sarah had printed copies of everything for each family. As they compared their experiences, the pattern became undeniable. Selective enforcement, moving goalposts, rules that appeared overnight and disappeared when convenient. "So what do we do?" asked Priya Patel. "I can't afford a legal battle. None of us can." Sarah looked around the room at faces filled with frustration and exhaustion. These were doctors, engineers, small business owners, teachers, people who'd worked hard to build lives in what they'd thought was a welcoming community. "I have an idea," Sarah said slowly, "but it's going to require all of us to be brave." She pulled out her laptop and showed them a news story from a nearby county where homeowners had exposed HOA discrimination. Channel 7 has an investigative reporter named Marcus Williams. He specializes in consumer protection and civil rights violations. "You want to go public?" asked Keisha Johnson. "I want to tell the truth. All of it. Every racist comment that was made off the record. Every selective enforcement action. Every time they moved the goalposts to exclude us from their perfect little neighborhood." The room fell silent. Sarah could see the fear in their faces, the very real concern about retaliation, property values, becoming targets of an even bigger campaign. "I'm in," said David suddenly. "I'm tired of pretending. This is normal." "Me too," said Maria Rodriguez. "My kids shouldn't have to grow up thinking this is acceptable." One by one, they committed. By the time the meeting ended, they had a plan. Monday morning, Sarah called Channel 7 News and asked to speak with Marcus Williams. When his assistant asked what the story was about, Sarah took a deep breath. "Systematic housing discrimination in Willowbrook Estates. I have documentation of racial bias in HOA enforcement going back 5 years, and I have 8 families willing to go on record." There was a pause. "Can you be here at 2 p.m.? Sarah looked at her pool through the kitchen window, the morning light still dancing on the water like it had 2 weeks ago when the world had seemed so much simpler. "We'll be there." As she hung up the phone, Sarah realized that her 30-day deadline to modify the pool was now meaningless. In less than 4 hours, she was about to turn Willowbrook Estates' dirty secret into front-page news. The HOA had given her 30 days to destroy her dream. She was about to destroy theirs in 30 minutes of television. Marcus Williams was not what Sarah had expected. The investigative reporter was younger than she'd imagined, maybe mid-30s, with an easy smile and the kind of intense focus that made her understand why people trusted him with their stories. His camera operator, a woman named Jessica, moved around the Channel 7 conference room like a choreographer, setting up angles while Marcus reviewed Sarah's evidence binders. "This is extensive," Marcus said, flipping through pages of meeting minutes and violation letters. "How long did it take you to compile all this?" "About a week of 16-hour days," Sarah replied, "but I had help." She gestured to David Park and Maria Rodriguez, who sat beside her at the polished conference table. The other families had wanted to participate but couldn't get time off work on such short notice. They'd agreed to be interviewed later if needed. Marcus looked up from a particularly damning email exchange between Margaret Pemberton and another board member. Mrs. Pemberton actually wrote, "We need to maintain the character of our community in response to your architectural approval." "That's unsubtle." "They got sloppy," David said. "I think they assumed we'd never compare notes." Jessica finished with the lighting setup and gave Marcus a thumbs up. "We're ready when you are." Sarah's mouth went dry. In 15 years of forensic accounting, she'd testified in depositions and court cases, but never on television. Never with her face and name attached to something that would live on the internet forever. "Before we start," Marcus said, his voice gentler than before, "I want you to understand what happens next. This story will air Wednesday night if my editor approves it. Once it's out there, there's no taking it back. Your HOA will respond, probably aggressively. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah thought about her pool, about 27 years of saving, about the look on Margaret Pemberton's face when she'd called it a spectacle. She thought about the Rodriguez children asking their parents why they had to remove their beautiful garden, about the Washington kids who couldn't play basketball in their own driveway. "I'm prepared." Marcus nodded to Jessica, who started rolling. "Tell me about your pool." For the next 2 hours, Sarah told her story. The dream, the savings, the careful research, the permits and approvals, the HOA meeting where she'd been ambushed by neighbors she'd considered friends, the impossible demands disguised as modifications. "And you believe this is about more than just your pool?" Marcus asked. Sarah looked directly into the camera. "I know it is." She opened the first binder. "In the past 5 years, every family that's faced HOA violations in Willowbrook Estates has been a family of color. Every single one. She walked Marcus through the evidence methodically, the way she'd present findings to a jury. The Patel's paint color violation, while identical houses remained untouched. The Rodriguez's excessive landscaping that matched approved projects on other streets. The Washington family's basketball hoop that violated noise ordinances that didn't exist when their white neighbors installed identical equipment. "David, tell me about your garden," Marcus said, turning to include David in the shot. David's jaw tightened. 20 years I've been designing landscapes. I have clients who pay me thousands of dollars for exactly the kind of garden I installed in my own front yard, but Margaret Pemberton told me it looked foreign and made people uncomfortable. She used those exact words. I have the recording. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. Recording. David pulled out his phone. I started recording all my interactions with the HOA after the first violation notice. One-party consent state. He played a snippet of audio where Margaret's voice was clearly audible. David, you have to understand, when people drive through Willowbrook, they expect to see traditional American landscaping. Your garden, while I'm sure it's beautiful in its own way, sends the wrong message about our community values. Jessica zoomed in on Marcus's face as he processed what he'd just heard. Have you shared this recording with anyone else? Just the families you see here today. We've all been documenting everything since we realized what was happening. Maria Rodriguez leaned forward. They made us feel like we were crazy, like we were imagining things. But when you see it all together, ... she gestured at the evidence spread across the table. There's no other explanation. Marcus asked about property values, about legitimate HOA functions, about whether they'd tried to resolve things internally. Sarah answered each question with documentation. The HOA's own records showed that properties in Willowbrook had increased in value since the families of color had moved in. The selective enforcement pattern was undeniable when laid out chronologically. What do you want to happen now? Marcus asked as the interview wound down. Sarah had been dreading this question because the answer felt so big, so impossible. Want accountability. I want the HOA to follow their own rules fairly for everyone. And I want people to know that this is happening in neighborhoods all across America, not just in some distant place they can ignore. After Marcus and Jessica left with promises to call by Tuesday evening, Sarah sat in her quiet house, feeling simultaneously emptied and electrified. David and Maria had gone home to prepare their families for what was coming. Tuesday crawled by. Sarah tried to work, tried to focus on spreadsheets and client files. But her mind kept wandering to Marcus's warning about HOA retaliation. Would that look like? More violation notices? Legal action? She'd never been in a public fight before. The call came at 7:43 p.m. Sarah, it's Marcus. The story's been approved. We're running it tomorrow night. As the lead story, he paused. But there's something you should know. We reached out to the HOA for comment, and they've hired a public relations firm. This is about to get very public very fast. Sarah's stomach dropped. What kind of PR firm? The kind that corporations hire when they're in crisis mode? They're calling this a misunderstanding and claiming you're a disgruntled homeowner trying to avoid legitimate architectural guidelines. Marcus's voice carried an edge of disgust. They're also suggesting that you've manipulated other residents into supporting a false narrative. Sarah looked out her kitchen window at the pool, which had been peaceful and beautiful for exactly 2 weeks before becoming the center of a war she'd never wanted to fight. What else? She asked, because Marcus's tone suggested there was more. They've scheduled their own press conference for Thursday morning, 1 hour after our story goes live online. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Sarah, they're not just defending themselves. They're coming after you personally. Are you ready for that? Sarah thought about Margaret Pemberton's satisfied smile at the HOA meeting, about the way her neighbors had looked at her like she was a problem to be solved. She thought about the other families who'd been quietly pushed around for years, told their success was somehow wrong, their presence unwelcome. Let them come, she said. I've got nothing to hide. But after she hung up, Sarah walked out to her pool and sat on the edge, her feet dangling in the water. In 24 hours, her private battle would become public spectacle. The HOA had spent weeks trying to shame her into destroying her pool quietly. Now they were about to discover What happened when you tried to shame someone who had already decided she was done being ashamed? The story broke at 6 a.m. when Channel 7 posted it online with the headline, "Willowbrook Estates HOA accused of systematic racial discrimination." By 7 a.m., Sarah's phone was buzzing with notifications from Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as the video went viral. By 8 a.m., there were news vans parked outside her house. Sarah stood at her front window, coffee mug in hand, watching reporters set up cameras on her front lawn. Her phone rang every 30 seconds. Journalists, talk show producers, lawyers offering free consultations, and friends from college who'd seen her face on the morning news. The doorbell rang at 8:47 a.m. Through the peephole, Sarah saw a young woman in a red blazer holding a microphone, flanked by a camera operator, Ms. Chen. "I'm Amanda Torres from News Channel 12. We'd love to get your reaction to the HOA's response to your allegations." Sarah's blood chilled. "What response? You haven't seen it? They released a statement an hour ago." Sarah yanked open the door. "What statement?" Amanda held up her phone, showing a professional-looking press release. "The Willowbrook Estates HOA is calling your story a coordinated attack by residents who refuse to follow community guidelines. They're claiming you organized a false discrimination narrative to avoid legitimate architectural violations." Sarah scanned the statement, her anger building with each line. The HOA claimed she'd manipulated vulnerable neighbors and fabricated evidence to avoid taking responsibility for her flagrant violations of community standards. But the worst part was, at the bottom, Ms. Chen's pool violates multiple safety and zoning regulations. "We have documentation proving that she installed this structure without proper permits, creating a liability risk for the entire community." "That's a lie," Sarah said, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "I have every permit, every inspection certificate, every approval document. They're lying." "Would you be willing to show us those documents on camera?" Sarah looked at the reporter, then at the growing crowd of media vehicles lining her street. This wasn't the controlled environment of Marcus Williams' conference room. This was chaos, and she was at the center of it. But Margaret Pemberton had just called her a liar on television. "Come in," Sarah said. For the next hour, Sarah's living room became a television studio. Amanda Torres was followed by reporters from 3 other local stations, a stringer from CNN, and a blogger from a civil rights organization. Sarah spread her documentation across the coffee table again and again, walking each crew through permits, inspections, and approval letters. At 10:30 a.m., her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Chen, this is Patricia Morrison from Morrison Keller and Associates. We represent the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association." Sarah's stomach dropped. "I don't have anything to say to you, Ms. Chen. My clients are prepared to offer you a reasonable settlement to resolve this matter quietly. If you withdraw your allegations and agree to modify your pool to community standards, the HOA is willing to cover 50% of the renovation costs." Sarah looked around her living room, still buzzing with reporters packing up equipment. "You're offering to pay me to shut up? We're offering to resolve this misunderstanding before it damages everyone involved. The only misunderstanding is your clients thinking, 'I'm going to back down.'" Sarah hung up. The phone rang again immediately. This time it was David Park. "Sarah, you need to see the Nextdoor app, right now." Sarah pulled up the neighborhood social media platform on her laptop. The Willowbrook Estates page was exploding with comments, and they weren't all supportive. "Sarah Chen has turned our peaceful neighborhood into a media circus. Our property values are going to tank because of her selfishness. I've lived here for 15 years and never seen any discrimination. She's playing the race card to avoid following the rules like everyone else. Maybe if she'd tried to fit in instead of showing off with that ridiculous pool, none of this would have happened." But there were other voices too. "I've been watching this HOA target families for years." Good for Sarah for finally speaking up. The double standard is obvious to anyone paying attention. White families get away with things that get other families fined. "I'm ashamed to live in a community where this is happening." Sarah's hands shook as she scrolled through dozens of comments. The neighborhood was splitting into factions, and she was the fault line. At noon, Marcus Williams called. Sarah, the HOA, just moved up their press conference to 2 p.m. They're not waiting until tomorrow. "What changed?" "You did. The video of you showing those permits to Amanda Torres is all over social media. They're hemorrhaging credibility, so they're going on the offensive. Sarah looked out her window. The media crowd had grown. News vans lined both sides of her street, and neighbors were gathering in small groups, some pointing at her house, others at the cameras. What are they going to say? I don't know, but my sources tell me they've got something big, something they think will discredit you completely. Sarah felt the world tilting. What could they possibly have? That's what worries me. Sarah, are you sure there's nothing in your background they could use against you? Nothing in your permits, or your business dealings, or your personal life? Sarah mentally reviewed her entire existence. 15 years of clean audits, a spotless credit report, no criminal record, not even a parking ticket in the past 5 years. There's nothing, Marcus. My life is boring. Then they're manufacturing something. Be ready. At 1:30 p.m., Sarah's doorbell rang again. This time it was Margaret Pemberton, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits. Sarah, Margaret said, her voice dripping with false concern. I think we should talk privately before this gets any more out of hand. Sarah looked at the men. Who are they? Legal counsel, said the taller one. We're here to discuss a resolution that protects everyone's interests, including mine. Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade, especially yours. Sarah, you're about to be very embarrassed. We have documentation that's going to change how people see this situation, but it doesn't have to come to that. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. What documentation? Building permits aren't the only permits that matter, Sarah. There are other kinds of permits, other kinds of inspections, other kinds of ... compliance issues. Sarah's mind raced. What were they talking about? She'd been meticulous about every aspect of the pool construction. I don't know what you're implying. Your business, Sarah. Chen and Associates Financial Services. The one you run out of your home office. Margaret's eyes glittered. The one that's been operating without proper municipal business licenses for the past 3 years. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She'd been so focused on the pool permits that she hadn't even thought about her business licenses. She'd moved to Willowbrook 3 years ago and had been meaning to update her registration with the new municipality, but it had never seemed urgent. Her clients were all over the state, and she'd been paying state taxes properly. That's a clerical error. I can fix that in a day. Not anymore, said the second man. As of this morning, we've filed a formal complaint with the municipal licensing board. Operating an unlicensed business is a misdemeanor. Running that business out of a residential property without proper zoning permits is another violation. Sarah felt the trap closing around her. Your manufacturing charges to discredit me. We're enforcing the law, Margaret said sweetly. All the laws, the ones that apply to everyone equally. Sarah looked at the 3 faces in front of her, understanding finally dawning. They hadn't just hired a PR firm. They'd hired investigators to dig through every aspect of her life, looking for anything they could use as ammunition. You have 30 minutes before our press conference, Margaret continued. Withdraw your allegations, agree to modify your pool, and we'll make the business license issue disappear quietly. Refuse, and we'll make sure everyone knows that the woman accusing us of selective enforcement has been selectively ignoring the law herself. Sarah looked past them to the news vans, to the neighbors watching from their windows, to the pool. That had started this whole mess. Get off my property, she said quietly. Margaret's smile widened. See you on television, Sarah. As they walked away, Sarah realized she had 28 minutes to decide whether to fold or to double down on a hand that might destroy her life. She pulled out her phone and called Marcus Williams. They're going to try to destroy me, she said without preamble, and they might succeed. Sarah, breathe, Marcus said through the phone. Tell me exactly what they have. Sarah paced her living room, stepping around camera cables left by the morning's media circus. Business license violations. I've been running my accounting firm from my home office for 3 years without updating my municipal registration. It's completely legitimate oversight IPE. All my state taxes. I'm properly licensed as a CPA, but technically, they're right. Shit. Marcus was quiet for a moment. How bad is the violation? Misdemeanor. Fine, probably. But, combined with the zoning issue, Sarah sank onto her couch. Marcus, they're going to make me look like a hypocrite on live television. The woman complaining about selective enforcement who's been selectively ignoring business laws. Or, Marcus said slowly, they're going to make themselves look like vindictive bullies who hired private investigators to dig up dirt on a woman whose only crime was building a pool. Sarah blinked. What? Think about it, Sarah. You missed a paperwork filing. That's not exactly Al Capone-level criminality. But they hired lawyers and investigators to dig through your personal life because you exposed their discrimination. Which story do you think plays better? Sarah felt a spark of hope. You think people will see through it? I think we're about to find out. But Sarah, there's something else. I've been working this story all morning, and I found something. His voice carried an edge of excitement. Do you know who Margaret Pemberton's husband Richard works for? Some consulting firm? Pemberton, Municipal Consulting. They specialize in helping municipalities streamline their licensing and permitting processes. Marcus paused to let that sink in. Sarah, Richard Pemberton, makes his living knowing exactly what business licenses are required in every township. In the county, there's no way this is a coincidence. Sarah's heart hammered. You think they've been planning this? I think they've been planning something ever since you got that architectural approval. The business license thing was their insurance policy. Sarah looked at the clock. 22 minutes until the press conference. What do? You tell the truth. All of it. The business license mistake, why you made it, how you're fixing it, and then you ask everyone watching a simple question, which is worse, a paperwork error or a coordinated campaign to destroy someone's life because they exposed your discrimination. At 1:55 p.m., Sarah stood in her backyard, looking at the pool that had started everything. The afternoon sun made the water shimmer like liquid gold, and for a moment she could almost remember what it felt like to simply enjoy something beautiful. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Park, watching the press conference. Whatever they say, we've got your back. Another from Maria Rodriguez. The truth is on our side. Don't let them intimidate you. Sarah walked to her front window and watched the live stream of the HOA press conference on her laptop. Richard Pemberton stood behind a podium in the community center, flanked by Margaret and 3 other board members. The same room where they'd ambushed her 2 weeks ago was now filled with reporters and cameras. Thank you for coming, Richard began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being believed. We're here to address the serious allegations made against the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association by Ms. Sarah Chen. Sarah gripped her coffee mug as Richard launched into a prepared statement about the HOA's commitment to fair enforcement and community standards. Ms. Chen's accusations of discrimination are not only false, they're deeply harmful to our community. When someone is caught violating multiple laws and regulations, it's natural to look for someone else to blame. Here it comes, Sarah thought. Our investigation has revealed that Ms. Chen has been operating an unlicensed business from her residence for 3 years, in violation of both municipal licensing requirements and residential zoning laws. This pattern of disregarding legal requirements extends to her pool installation, which violates several community guidelines that she was clearly informed about. Margaret stepped forward. It's unfortunate that Ms. Chen chose to make false accusations rather than simply following the same rules that apply to everyone else in our community. Sarah's phone exploded with notifications, text messages, missed calls, social media mentions. The news was spreading in real time. But then Richard said something that made Sarah's blood freeze. We also want to address concerns that have been raised about the HOA's treatment of other residents. These allegations are equally false. In fact, we have documentation showing that Ms. Chen specifically targeted and coached other residents to make similar complaints, creating a coordinated campaign of false accusations. Sarah stared at the screen. They were claiming she'd manipulated the other families, that the discrimination pattern was something she'd manufactured. We have recordings of Ms. Chen meeting with other residents in her home, providing them with template complaints and coaching them on what to say to investigators. Sarah's mind reeled. How could they have recordings of meetings in her own house? Her phone rang. It was David Park, and he sounded panicked. Sarah, they're saying we coordinated our stories, that you coached us, David. That's insane. We compared experiences. We didn't make anything up. I know that, but they're making it sound like some kind of conspiracy. And Sarah, David's voice dropped. They mentioned the recordings I made of Margaret. They're claiming I made them at your direction, that it was entrapment. Sarah felt the walls closing in. Everything they'd done to document the truth was being twisted into evidence. Of a conspiracy? But then she remembered something Marcus had said. Which story plays better? Sarah looked around her living room, at the evidence binders still scattered across her coffee table, at the permits and approvals that proved her pool was legal, at the documentation showing years of discriminatory enforcement. She thought about the Rodriguez children who couldn't understand why their beautiful garden was suddenly wrong, about the Washington kids who couldn't play basketball in their own driveway, about David Park's 20 years of expertise being dismissed as too ethnic. Sarah picked up her phone and called Marcus Williams. "I'm ready to respond," she said. "Sarah, are you sure? They just threw everything they had at you on live television." Sarah walked to her back door and looked out at her pool one more time. In 30 minutes, she was either going to save her reputation or destroy it completely. "Marcus, can you get your camera crew back here? I want to hold my own press conference." When Sarah looked at the clock, the HOA press conference was wrapping up, and she could see reporters already heading to their vans, probably planning to come to her house for reaction quotes. "Right now, in my backyard, next to the pool, they're so desperate to destroy Sarah. They want to make this about paperwork and conspiracies and business licenses. Fine, let's talk about all of that. But let's also talk about the one thing they can't explain away." "What's that?" Sarah smiled grimly as she watched Margaret Pemberton's satisfied face on the screen, knowing that in 20 minutes she was about to wipe that smug expression away forever. "The truth?" At 3:17 p.m., Sarah Chen stood beside her pool in a navy blue blazer, facing 7 news cameras and 24 reporters. The afternoon sun reflected off the water behind her, creating the kind of dramatic backdrop that would look perfect on the evening news. She'd chosen this spot deliberately, not hiding from the pool that had started everything, but claiming it. Marcus Williams stood with the other reporters, his expression unreadable. Sarah had asked him to treat her like any other source, to ask the hard questions she knew were coming. Ms. Chen called Amanda Torres from Channel 12, the HOA. "Just presented evidence that you've been operating an unlicensed business and coaching other residents to make false discrimination claims. How do you respond?" Sarah looked directly into the cameras. "I'm going to tell you something the HOA doesn't want you to know. Everything they just said about me is technically true and completely irrelevant." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Of reporters, Sarah had just admitted to the violations on live television. "Yes, I missed filing municipal business license paperwork when I moved to Willowbrook 3 years ago. It was an oversight, not fraud. I've been paying all my state taxes, maintaining my CPA certification, and operating a legitimate business. The day I discovered the oversight, I filed the correct paperwork. That was this morning." Sarah pulled out a folder. "Here's the filing receipt, time-stamped at 9:43 a.m., 2 hours before the HOA's press conference." She set the folder aside and looked back at the cameras. "But here's what they didn't tell you. Richard Pemberton, the HOA president who's been attacking my credibility, owns a consulting firm that specializes in municipal licensing requirements. He knew exactly what paperwork I was missing because that's his job." Sarah could see phones coming out as reporters started fact-checking. In real time, the question isn't whether I made a paperwork error. The question is why the HOA hired private investigators to dig through my personal life. The moment I exposed their discrimination pattern, Ms. Chen called Marcus Williams, playing his role perfectly. "What about their claim that you coordinated false allegations with other residents?" Sarah smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I'm glad you asked that, because that's where their story falls apart completely." She pulled out her phone and opened a voice memo app. "Margaret Pemberton accused me of coaching David Park to secretly record her discriminatory comments, but Mrs. Pemberton seems to have forgotten something important." Sarah pressed play. Margaret's voice filled the backyard, clear and unmistakable. "David, you have to understand, when people drive through Willowbrook, they expect to see traditional American landscaping. Your garden, while I'm sure it's beautiful in its own way, sends the wrong message about our community values." "That recording was made 6 months ago," Sarah continued, as reporters scribbled frantically. 3 months before I ever spoke to Mr. Park about HOA issues. 3 months before we realized we weren't alone." Sarah pulled out another folder, this one thick with documents. The HOA claims we manufactured a discrimination pattern. So let me walk you through the actual timeline. For the next 10 minutes, Sarah methodically destroyed the HOA's narrative. She showed meeting minutes, proving that Margaret Pemberton had raised concerns about her pool before construction began. She presented the architectural guidelines that her pool clearly met, alongside photos of larger, more elaborate pools owned by white residents that had never faced scrutiny. The Hendersons' pool, Sarah said, holding up photos, is 40% larger than mine and has a waterfall feature. Approved without question. The Crafts installed LED lighting that's visible from 3 blocks away. No violations. The Johnsons built a pool house that isn't mentioned anywhere in the architectural guidelines. Unanimous approval. She turned to face the cameras directly. The only difference between those pools and mine isn't size or style or lighting. It's the color of the skin of the people who own them. Ms. Chen called a reporter from the back. If this is really about discrimination, why didn't you file a civil rights complaint instead of going to the media? Sarah had been waiting for this question because I tried to handle this quietly. First, I requested the specific guidelines my pool supposedly violated. They couldn't provide them. I asked for clarification on the violations. They couldn't explain them. I offered to make reasonable modifications. They demanded I demolish a structure that met every code and regulation. Sarah's voice grew stronger. I went to the media because they left me no choice, and because I realized that staying quiet wasn't protecting just MIT, was protecting them. She gestured to the house behind her. This is my home. That pool represents 27 years of saving, planning, and dreaming. But it's not really about the pool anymore. Sarah looked around at the faces, watching her reporter's neighbors gathered at property lines. Her own reflection in camera lenses that would carry this moment to thousands of homes. It's about whether communities like Willowbrook Estates can systematically exclude people who don't fit their vision of what belongs here, then destroy anyone who speaks up about it. It's about whether making a paperwork mistake makes you fair game for a campaign of personal destruction. It's about whether we're going to pretend that racism doesn't exist as long as it wears a suit and speaks politely about community standards. Sarah paused, letting her words settle. The HOA spent this morning trying to convince you that I'm a liar, a criminal, and a manipulator. But they can't explain one simple fact. If my pool really violates community guidelines, why can't they tell me which guidelines it violates? She picked up a single sheet of paper from her folder. This morning, after their press conference, I received this email from the HOA's legal counsel. It's a settlement offer. They'll drop all violation claims and cover the cost of the business license filing if I agree to stop talking to the media and sign a non-disclosure agreement. Sarah looked directly into the nearest camera. If I'm really a criminal who's been manufacturing false discrimination claims, why are they trying to pay me to be quiet? The backyard fell silent, except for the gentle hum of the pool's filtration system. I'm not taking their settlement, Sarah continued. I'm not signing their NDA, and I'm not backing down. She gestured to the pool behind her, its surface still, and perfect in the afternoon light. This pool isn't going anywhere. But more importantly, neither am I. A reporter called out, "What happens next?" Sarah smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Next, we file a federal civil rights complaint. Next, we demand a complete audit of every HOA decision made in the past 5 years. Next, we make sure that what happened to me and the other families never happens to anyone else. She looked around at the crowd one more time. And next, I'm going to enjoy my pool, because that's what it was built for. As the reporters packed up their equipment and scattered to file their stories, Sarah remained by the water's edge. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across her backyard. In a few hours, her words would be broadcast across the region. By tomorrow, the story would be national news. Margaret and Richard Pemberton had tried to shame her into silence, then destroy her when silence failed. They'd underestimated one crucial thing. Sarah Chen had spent her entire career following paper trails, uncovering hidden patterns, and presenting the truth in ways that couldn't be denied. They'd picked a fight with the wrong accountant. Sarah kicked off her shoes and sat on the edge of the pool, letting her feet dangle in the warm water. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. Tomorrow would bring new battles. The civil rights complaint, the media attention, the inevitable retaliation from people who didn't want their comfortable world disrupted by inconvenient truths. But tonight, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky and reflected off the surface of her beautiful, controversial, perfectly legal pool, Sarah Chen was exactly where she belonged. At home, in the community she'd helped to change forever.